Honourable Annette King.
Speaker, we have just heard from the Minister for Social Development, and it was interesting to hear her final comments of her speech about children. And one of the things that she has disappointed me most in, that she has been more about talk than action in her 2.5 years as Minister. Although she has said how much she cares about children, she doesn't actually follow it up with action. And I'm looking forward to the day when there will be some real action and children in New Zealand will be put at the centre of a government's policy. Mr. Speaker, I have heard the words bland, boring, no vision, no plan, no ideas, and a budget for yesterday, not tomorrow. And those are some of the comments that we've heard from around New Zealand on the National Party's third budget. And I'd like to add a few other words to those ones, Mr. Speaker. There's been quite a lot of creative accounting in this budget. There's a fair dose of dodgy figures in this budget. Some very heroic assumptions have been made in this budget, and the whole lot's been mixed up with a very big handful of fairy dust. And the public over many, many months, I believe, have been played like a fiddle leading up to this budget. They've been assisted, the government's been assisted by the media, by the commentators and by the cheerleaders for the National Party, all playing the same tune as we went into this budget. People were softened up to expect a tough budget. There was going to be no new spending. It was a budget about savings and about growth. And there were going to be cuts to projects that were nice to have, although they've never been defined as what nice to have are. It was going to be about the unaffordability of the growing deficit we have in this country. And we were told week in, week out, over and over again, that we were borrowing $380 million a week, that it was unsustainable, unavoidable and unacceptable. And New Zealanders were told in this budget they would have to take the pain. They'd have to accept the pain. They'd have to swallow the cuts that were coming, and they had to stop complaining about selling our power companies and Air New Zealand because there was no alternative. They had to do this. The poor government were forced into this position, and that was the mantra we heard week in, week out. And I believe the public were played like a fiddle. Only the truth is the public are being fiddled by the National Party. Because if you have a look at the National Party's budget, it is based on some pretty dodgy figures indeed. And they're now emerging, coming out weeks after the budget has been presented. We're starting to get the true picture of what this budget actually meant. Let's take the first dodgy figure, the need to borrow $380 million a week, equivalent to $86 for every man, woman and child in New Zealand every week had to be borrowed. Only we've now discovered after the budget's been presented and came out not by them being upfront about it, but the public learn, in fact, Bill English has been borrowing $100 million more a week than he needed to borrow. But miraculously, before the election, they won't need to borrow so much. So good will their management of the economy be. No one would argue that they ought not to borrow when the terms are good. But why not be honest and upfront about what you're borrowing and why you are borrowing it? Because New Zealanders are clever enough to understand if they are told. But it had to be uncovered and drawn out as to what was happening. They used that $380 million borrowing per week as a way to scare New Zealanders. They made people much more worried than they needed to be. They worried about their own personal situation. They saw jobs going. They saw their partners' jobs going. They saw prices that were rising faster than their wages. They looked at their food bill. They looked at their power bill and their petrol costs. They looked at their rent going up, and they could see that the tax cuts that were supposed to help them and the income assistance that was there was less than the rising prices that they were facing. And they knew that they were not getting compensation in their wages or from those tax cuts. And so they were very worried about their own situation, and loaded on top of them, the government then made them worry about the position this country was in. It was about to implode because we were borrowing $380 million a week. It's been beautifully orchestrated by the National Party. You see, what they were doing was covering up their own economic incompetence. They used the shadow of the Christchurch earthquake and the Pike River disaster, along with alarming Kiwis, to set up what I believe is an agenda to push through their old, tired policies of the past. It was all about positioning for the election. There's no denying, Mr. Speaker, that we have to reduce our government borrowing in this country. It does need to be tackled, and a Labor government would do that. But why not be honest about what we're borrowing? Why not front up to the public of New Zealand and say what it's going to be spent on? Because the first step in a recovery plan is to be honest about the situation you face. And we have not had that sort of transparency from this government. Own up to the fact that this government is borrowing for the tax cuts they gave to thousands of well-paid New Zealanders last year. Stop the fudge about it. Stop the fiddle about it. It is a fact. This government is borrowing to pay for tax cuts for the top income earners in New Zealand. We could not afford those tax cuts, but they gave them anyway. And you know, the irony of it is that they made changes in this budget to working for families. I believe it brings them in about $300 or $400 million on the changes they made to KiwiSaver that affect middle-income earners, up to around 80,000, 90,000 joint income a year. You know, Mr. Speaker, you could have been much fairer if you just lifted the top tax rate a little for those who got the big windfall in the tax cuts last year and brought in the same amount of money. So who did they tackle? Who did they hit? They hit middle-income earners with families to grab money off them, but left the high-income earners in this country with their tax cuts and the money in their pocket. There was no fairness in that, Mr. Speaker. So then let's have a look at some of the fairy dust they sprinkled around at the time of the budget. Have a look at the jobs that are going to be created over the next 4 years. 170,000 jobs we're going to get. Wasn't that the same figure that they promised in 2010 budget? I believe it is, Mr. Speaker. In fact, if you look at the budget additional information estimates, there's 155 new jobs are going to come between now and 2015. That's actually 10,000 fewer than they had in last year's budget. There are not going to be those jobs out there unless there is a change in this government's direction and a proper plan to create those jobs. And in fact, unemployment has gone up, not down. And then we had the fairy dust about how our economy was going to grow by 4% every year over the next 4 years. Even Treasury's backing away from that prediction. And then guess what? There's more. We can look forward to wage increases of between 4 and 5% every year for the next 4 years. Who believes that? Certainly the public do not. And then we had the doozy of them all, the creative accounting in the budget, where in fact we're going to be allowed to choose whether we sell our assets or not. We're going to get to choose by voting at the next election. But when you look in the budget documents, they've already cashed up. They've banked the money already over the next 4 years. So they've sold our assets. It is a con job. There is no choice, New Zealanders. They've banked the money from the sale of those assets. And then we get to KiwiSaver, the other bit of a fiddle that went on. We get to choose whether we want to change the KiwiSaver, only they're already cutting the $10 a week tax credit from New Zealanders from the 1st of July. This budget is not about a forward plan, it's about pulling the wool over the eyes of New Zealanders.
Simon Bridges.